Honor, courage, tradition, and ambition. Swords, pistols, and knives.
Now, Major, you die.
The facts and the fiction.
The Western gunfight on television is completely preposterous.
The deadly courage of Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson would accept a challenge at the drop of a hat, and he would issue a challenge at the drop of a hat.
Ready, Mr. Burr?
And the disastrous victory of Aaron Burr.
He's vulnerable to attack as a sort of vicious, bloodthirsty murderer.
Fearless men, dangerous women. Their fame and victory, their shame and defeat. From the most bizarre encounters to perhaps the greatest duel of them all.
When the North began to attack the South for the sin of slaveholding, that was an insult.
As a European tradition crossed the Atlantic, the history of deadly duels. Dueling in the New World. America, land of the free, home of the brave. America, child of Western Europe, offspring of Great Britain. In dueling, America discovered a contrast between what it dreamed and what it inherited, an ancient European custom rooted in elitism. It found surprising new life in a land where all men are created equal. Dueling, a remarkable time machine to the past. It began 1,000 years before Columbus. "500 years after the birth of Christ, barbarian warlords in Western Europe relied on God's intervention in single combat to prove who was wrong or right in disputes over property or criminal behavior. They called them trials by combat. 500 years later, knights fought only other knights in duels of chivalry, but they fought over broad issues of integrity, honesty, bravery, and loyalty. And just as Europeans were first finding the New World during the Renaissance, noble gentlemen, courtiers, began to duel. With them, man-against-man combat was a mad passion. They dueled without the king's permission and in defiance of the law over great and slight issues of a man's character, his status, his honor.
In those days, you had a different ethical system, and it was based upon one's relationship to one's neighbors, one's friends, and particularly one's relatives. We have now a sense of individuality. Every man stands up for himself or a woman, and we like to think that what we do helps to define who we are. In those days, it was, in what family do you belong? What are your ancestors like? Who were they? Are you from the, are you to the manor born? Are you well born? Bloodlines counted much more.
Honor means basically your reputation. There's an equivalency between honor and reputation. What the community thinks about you is more important than what you think about yourself.
A man's honor was his most valued possession, and was a possession that it was worth dying for to have. It was the most central element of his being.
As Europeans landed in the New World, they brought dueling with them. One of the first recorded duels in the New World took place on June 18, 1621, near Plymouth Rock. Two servants fought with rapiers and daggers. The cause is unknown. One was injured in the thigh, the other the hand, and they were both punished. Their feet and hands tied together for 24 hours, a penalty less for their violence and more for participating in a custom reserved for gentlemen. An ironic beginning to dueling history in the land of the free.
There was a question of why dueling would be so common, because America was trying to cast off any form of aristocracy. This whole notion of dueling is something that is English, that is aristocratic, it is anti-American.
The It wasn't until the late 1700s and the Revolutionary War, however, that dueling took hold in America. It was brought over by French, German, and British officers who came to the New World to fight on both sides. American officers emulated their counterparts, hoping to gain social status and demonstrate bravery. One of the best-known duels of the era was between two Georgians. One, State Commander-in-Chief and signer of the Declaration of Independence, Button Gwinnett, and the other, Continental Army General Lachlan McIntosh, who had impugned Gwinnett's character by calling him a scoundrel and lying rascal. Gwinnett was fatally wounded. Because he died in a duel and had signed the Declaration of Independence, at last sale, his autograph was worth more than $100,000. Following the Revolutionary War and into the beginning of the 1800s, dueling and its customs, its code of honor, continued to grow. But with the foreign armies departed and much of the American military decommissioned, its principal supporters were the new elites in the 13 states, men struggling to create new hierarchies and standards of behavior. In the North, they were principally politicians, lawyers, and editors. In the West, where dueling was a form of frontier justice, they were politicians, miners, and merchants. And in the South, where dueling was a particular passion, they were principally landowners, the Southern aristocracy.
I think it had a lot to do with the fact that Southerners particularly saw themselves as the heirs of some sort of English aristocracy, that the model that they used, which was the Virginia model for a planter, was modeled on the English gentry. And so a gentleman settled his affairs in a certain way, and that obviously would have been by having a duel.
The other element of Southern life that was particularly compatible with dueling was slavery. Dueling and its code supported and reinforced a value system that defined those with honor and those without it, the class structure of master and slave.
Honor and dueling as part of that scheme is very important in a slave society, because one is trying to demonstrate authority, ritualized authority as much as possible, rather than slavery being considered simply a matter of brute force and brute coercion. What one really expects is for slaves to show deference, and therefore you should expect deference from your fellow whites as well. And certainly a master of a plantation felt as if he were a lord of an estate, and felt that he had the right to run his show, his establishment, the same as any medieval knight would in his time.
In the South, as elsewhere, the rules for dueling were printed in pamphlets, treatises, and books. The best known was the Code of Honor, Rules for the Government of Principals and Seconds in Dueling by South Carolina Governor John Lyde Wilson. These documents outlined the procedures, beginning with the root of all duels, the insult to a man's honor.
Good day.
The most trivial insult might be failing to recognize or greet a fellow gentleman. More serious was to insult the character of a man's wife or mistress, and most serious of all was a physical assault, no matter how minor.
Nose tweaking is also, again, amazingly humorous sounding, but was actually really serious. You know, for a man of honor to touch another man of honor, particularly to touch his face or his head, is amazingly dishonorable. And so one thing you can do if you are a man of honor and someone has insulted you and refuses to allow you to clear your name, one thing that you are justified to do is to tweak his nose. And this was serious enough that there's one account in which a politician is describing in great detail this nose tweaking that took place. And he spends a lot of time talking about whether the fingers actually touched the nose or not. You know, I think they touched the nose. Maybe they didn't. And this is the determinant of whether this is serious or not. Maybe he didn't really touch him.
Sir, how dare you threaten that?
A man who insulted a gentleman, particularly by physically assaulting him, could expect a quick response. The type of response, however, often depended on whether the offended man felt that he was being insulted by an equal, another gentleman. If he thought the aggressor was beneath him socially, he might respond not by challenging him to a duel, but with a caning.
A gentleman would not duel with someone who was outside of his class. You would neither accept a challenge from someone who was outside of your class, nor would you challenge someone. A planter wouldn't challenge a blacksmith, for instance, or any kind of an artisan to engage in a duel. A gentleman would challenge another gentleman. So you were neither obligated to challenge nor obligated to accept a challenge from someone who was outside your class. More likely, if you had a grievance with someone who was not a part of the upper classes, a gentleman could cane. That is, gentlemen carried walking canes in the 19th century, so it was appropriate for you then to take the cane and crack them over the head with it, or to take a horsewhip and to whip them.
The message is that, that you have no respect. You're utterly in contempt of this individual, that he doesn't deserve the chance to fight you on equal terms because he is not worthy of that privilege.
A caning is a really serious thing. You know, it sounds sort of humorous that someone sort of wanders in the street with a cane and bops a printer over the head, but there's actually a printer who's paralyzed from the waist down from one of these canings. There's someone whose skull is literally split on the street by a caning. They're lethal, as lethal, you know, possibly as being shot at.
However, assuming that the gentlemen agreed that they were social equals, peers, there still might be some reticence about escalating the disagreement to a duel. Often there was a final public insult used to embarrass and goad the less enthusiastic gentleman into a duel.
In justice to my character, I denounce to the world John Randolph, a member of Congress, as a prevaricating, base, calumniating scoundrel, poltroon, and coward.
These fighting words were said face to face, printed in a newspaper, or tacked up in a town square as a posting. They expressed a gentleman's disdain for another gentleman and were so offensive that no honorable man could ignore them.
It was very common to call people a coward and a liar. In fact, the most common phrase was, "Sir, you are a coward, a liar, and a poltroon," which a poltroon is really basically the worst type of coward that there is. My favorite insult was one where one gentleman called another an ugly, gawky, Yankee-looking fellow, as if that was the greatest insult in the world to be described as a Yankee, or looking like a Yankee.
Today, these insults seem mild or humorous, but to a Southern gentleman in the 19th century, they were worth dying for.
If the man challenged did not respond by a challenge to a duel, he was considered to be exactly that: a liar, a coward, a poltroon, and a man unworthy of the company of gentlemen.
Remember the old children's rhyme about sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me? Well, that's a very modern notion of honor. Southerners in the 19th century would have said, yes, names do very much hurt me, and by insulting me, you have basically taken away the one thing that's important to me, that means more than anything else in the world, and that's my reputation.
A lot of it is related to language. And how language can actually wound. Sticks and stones don't hurt my bones, but they certainly did in those days. Words were weapons, and they were used as weapons.
Once the challenge was accepted, each duelist selected a second. The second's job was to represent his principal in the upcoming negotiations. The date, the weapons, the firing distance, how many shots, to first blood or to the death. They also chose the location.
Well, right now we're standing in front of the Dueling Oaks in City Park. This was the most popular place anywhere in the city of New Orleans and possibly in the United States for many, many years in reference to dueling. This was the outskirts of town. If you came here early in the morning, almost any day, you could witness a duel. It is estimated that 10 to 12 duels per week were held here, and the most that I could find in one day, we had 12 in one day under the Dueling Oaks.
In general, the man who received the challenge was given the right to propose the weapon. In the early years of dueling in the New World, when military officers still carried sabers and associated it with the elitism of nobility, the weapon of choice was the sword. In cities like New Orleans, with a particularly strong connection to Europe, there were and are still streets like Exchange Alley, where men learn their deadly craft in fencing academies from fencing masters. And in the city's cemeteries, there are still the remains of those duelists who failed and succeeded on the field of honor.
Well, this is St. Vincent de Paul Cemetery, and some very famous people are buried here, this being not only one of the great people of New Orleans, he was, in my humble estimation, the greatest of all of those who were involved in the dueling business. His name was Pepe Julia, and what made him so good is the fact that he was a master of every instrument of destruction. To show those who were going to be fighting against him, put a little fear in their hearts, I guess, he would actually take his son and put an egg on top of his head, and with a pistol would shoot it every time. Then to show his power with a rifle, he would have people stand around in a circle, and they'd throw coins in the air, and 25 out of 25 he very seldom missed. If they wanted to use a Bowie knife, that was a mistake, because of all of those who used the Bowie knife, nobody used it better than Pepe Julia. And by the way, it is said that he was so good at what he did, he actually bought this cemetery. This was owned by him in the 1850s, and I say he was the greatest because if you'll notice, he died, he was 78 years of age. He died of natural causes.
But in most of the United States, including the South, there were few real aristocrats trained in fencing, and even fewer fencing schools. Therefore, the most popular dueling weapon was the pistol.
If you fought a duel with swords, a skilled swordsman had a tremendous advantage over a novice. However, when you're standing on the dueling ground and you're fighting and you're firing on the count of 3, it's just simply a matter of steady nerves and being able to squeeze off the round without jerking the gun and putting the bullet where it's supposed to go. So the level of skill is much less. But what you need is iron nerve.
Even a minor wound in these days, because of this lack of knowledge about infection and how to control infection, could kill a man. A very slight wound, something we would almost laugh at today, could kill you in those days because of this lack of knowledge.
When it came to dueling with pistols, there were many risks. Not only was there the potential trauma from the bullet penetrating the skin, but in an age where germs were barely understood and antibiotics unknown, the possibility of a bullet pushing outside material into the wound and causing blood poisoning, gangrene, and death was frightening.
Well, when a bullet strikes a man, it's going to pass through his coat, through his vest, through his shirt. It may take a metal decorative button that was typical in that period into the wound. Probably one of the strangest wounds I've ever read about was a man's pocket watch was in his vest pocket. It was carried into his chest, and all these pieces of the pocket watch, the hands, the wheels, the crystal, all acted as a place for bacteria to collect because they were unsterile, and that man died from the infection caused by that.
In fact, in 1806, one duelist, a knowledgeable military surgeon, knowing how wounds were often aggravated when bullets forced pieces of fabric into the body, arrived on the field of honor and then completely disrobed. His opponent, dumbfounded, refused to face the man au naturel and left without seeking any further satisfaction. All the negotiations surrounding the duel could take days, sometimes weeks. Often the amount of paperwork created was huge. One duel in Georgia generated 17 documents over just 3 days. But this may have been the intention.
It maybe is intended to give the chance for cooler heads to prevail, that it's going to let them think things through. It's also the same as when they arrived at the dueling grounds and they had the surgeon spread his instruments out so everyone can see them. They're hoping that they're going to look at this and say, well, wait a minute, he's going to use this on me if I'm shot. So I think that this was a way to maybe make them rethink the whole issue.
Other duelists used more cunning methods to avoid shedding blood.
Abraham Lincoln was challenged to a duel in 1842. And It was a true, serious challenge, and Lincoln kind of took it offhandedly, and he suggested that the form of weapons would be cow patties. Well, this didn't go too well, so his opponent challenged him further, and Lincoln chose broadswords. Well, since Lincoln was yay high and had a reach far beyond the normal person, and his opponent was of shorter stature, he declined. So Lincoln was once again outsmarted his opponent and avoided any form of bloodshed.
Gentlemen, are you ready?
However, assuming that neither lengthy negotiations nor a more clever subterfuge resolved the dispute, honorable gentlemen ultimately did meet on the field of honor. Facing death with their reputations, their honor on the line, all eyes were on their courage and comportment.
The purpose of the Code of Honor was in part to prove how in control you were over your emotions, how you're willing to die, you will stand unflinchingly while you are shot at. It is really this ability to prove yourself emotionless that proves that you are a man of honor. You are in total control.
Andrew Jackson was probably the most famous, probably notorious dueler in the Old South. Jackson would accept a challenge at the drop of a hat, and he would issue a challenge at the drop of a hat.
Well, I think what is interesting, and we might say ironic, that the founder of the Democratic Party, the first modern party in the history of Western civilization, was founded by a man who adhered to these very primitive ideas about honor and the right to duel and the importance of dueling itself.
One of the South's most famous duelists was also a future president of the United States. Andrew Jackson was an intelligent, quick-tempered, and ambitious man from South Carolina. A self-made military man and entrepreneur with humble roots, Jackson used dueling to enhance his social status and to outshine political rivals.
And we know that his family was probably of the middling sort. He was an orphan at a young age, and this was a way for him to challenge political contenders and also to prove his status as a gentleman and as a man in Southern society. By fighting these duels, it made him a famous person. It proved he was a man. It proved he was a gentleman.
By the time he ran for the presidency of the United States in 1828, Andrew Jackson had fought as many as 14 duels. Many of them were in response to comments about his marriage to his wife, Rachel.
He and Rachel was married to a man prior to marrying Jackson. They had gone to Natchez to get married under the assumption that Rachel had obtained a divorce from Mr. Robards. Well, the divorce really had not gone through yet. So for the rest of his life, because Rachel died before the President Jackson did, the rest of his life he spent defending her honor and her reputation from any challenger at all.
Andrew Jackson's most famous duel was with a lawyer who was considered one of the best shots in Tennessee, Charles Dickinson. The duel was a testament to both Jackson's self-control and his bloodthirstiness. The underlying cause may have been comments about Rachel, but the overt cause was a betting dispute that led to Dickinson calling Jackson a worthless scoundrel, a poltroon, and a coward, and Jackson's consequent challenge.
Your conduct and expressions relative to me of late have been of such a nature and so insulting that it requires and shall have my notice. I hope, sir, your courage will be an ample security to me that I will obtain speedily that which is due me for the insults offered.
They met near the Kentucky border on Thursday, May 29, 1806. The standard distance for a duel was 10 paces, about 30 feet. Jackson and Dickinson chose a deadly distance of 8 paces. Facing each other, Jackson's thin profile was made an even tougher target by his broad coat.
Jackson had wrapped himself in a large coat, which was very common in order to present a larger target, hopefully that your antagonist would fire and hit you in the coat maybe rather than hitting you in the body.
Are you ready?
Jackson's second, John Overton, announced the duel.
Fire!
Dickinson got his shot off first. Jackson swayed slightly and put his hand to his chest. Jackson had been hit. 2 ribs were broken. But to Dickinson, it appeared that Jackson was uninjured.
Great God, have I missed him?
In horror, Dickinson stepped back from his position. Overton enforced the rules which said that both duelists must maintain their position. Jackson, fighting back the pain, uncertain of the gravity of his injury but determined to better Dickinson, slowly raised his gun, took aim, and pulled the trigger. But there was no explosion. Jackson's gun had misfired. Undaunted, Jackson again cocked the pistol. Facing a defenseless and terrified Dickinson, Jackson fired. This time the gun discharged. The bullet met its mark. Dickinson fell, soon to die. Jackson recovered within a month, but his reputation took longer to heal. At issue was whether Jackson should have worn such a broad coat, obscuring his body shape, and also whether once his gun misfired, Jackson should have held his fire.
Well, he was highly censured for this whole duel. There was a feeling that he had murdered Dickinson, and that this was really not to his credit. Many people had considered that he had violated the code of honor, that he had shamed himself in the process, and that he basically did not want this simply to be a matter of honor, that he actually wanted to kill Dickinson.
I'm going to back him up because I think that while the coat was, Dickinson did fire, and he did miss him by only 1/4 of an inch. I mean, he could have killed him. Jackson, I think, had every right to fire back at this point, and Jackson later said, now this is definitely so, Jackson said, when asked why he fired a second time or took that second shot, he said, I thought I was going to die. And he wasn't going to have Dickinson live and he die. Otherwise, he said, maybe if I'd known how it was going to turn out, I wouldn't have fired. But as it was, he was given a choice, and he I think, did the honorable thing.
One of the most famous Southern duels was actually a melee that erupted following a formal duel near Natchez, Mississippi, in August of 1827. It took place on and took its name from the Vidalia Sandbar. At its center was Jim Bowie, an early American folk hero.
And keep in mind, this was an era when men became heroes not because they were TV stars or starred in a TV sitcom or something like that. Men became heroes because of real deeds. And Bowie, because of this Vidalia Sandbar fight, became very well known.
The Vidalia Sandbar fight not only made Jim Bowie famous, but also his knife. This wide, single-edged knife would soon become one of America's most popular side weapons and an important accompaniment to early pistols.
The problem with these pistols is that they often misfired, and even if you carried 2 pistols, you only had 2 shots.
The very interesting thing about a Bowie knife is that you don't never have to reload the knife. As opposed to a pistol, the Bowie knife was always there, was always ready. If you were out of ammunition, you still had your knife.
And if a pistol could not fire, it was no better than a very poor club, and that's where the Bowie knife came into play.
It seems that following a formal and orderly duel between 2 political rivals, a shootout erupted between their supporters. Jim Bowie, representing one faction, had only his knife to protect it against 2 other men. The first, named Colonel Crane, came at Bowie with the butt of a pistol and bashed Bowie's head. Bowie fell dazed to the ground. The second man, Major Wright, following up on Crane's blow, unsheathed the slender sword from his walking cane. Aiming for Bowie's heart, he missed, but still hit Bowie in the side of the ribcage. Bowie, seemingly defenseless on his back, powerfully pulled his opponent down on top of him. With Wright's cane sword disabled, Bowie could bring his deadly knife into play.
Now, Major, you die. Ugh.
The knife wound was fatal. The tale of Bowie's courage and his knife spread throughout America, particularly the South. Bowie's life was filled with other tales of courage, including his death at the Alamo. His spectacular life story helped popularize the knife that's still known by his name today. Though dueling in the northern United States was less common and frequently less deadly than dueling in the South, it still had a powerful impact. In the North, the great supporters of the Code of Honor were not plantation owners, but lawyers, editors, and politicians. In general, anyone with ambition who moved in political circles.
Today, politics are not as personally important to Americans as they were in the 19th century. There were far fewer pastimes in America in the 19th century. There were very few sports. Entertainment was rare. Politics was one of the principal passions of American life in the 19th century.
Well, it's a curious thing because we think of the United States as being very democratic, but in those days, the politicians considered themselves, and rightly so, as the gentry, as the individuals who really ran society, and the common people were something else. And so you're talking about a fraternity, in a sense, a fraternity of like-minded, ambitious rivals for public office.
The most famous duel in American political history took place in 1804 between then Secretary of the Treasury and Federalist Party leader Alexander Hamilton and Vice President and Republican Party leader Aaron Burr.
The Burr-Hamilton duel is one of the most interesting in the country because here you have the representatives of the major parties. Can one imagine Albert Gore fighting a duel with George Bush or someone, you know, some other figure? But that was the situation.
They both have such similar careers. They both are in the Army together, fighting together. Apparently might have known each other during the Revolution. Both end up in national politics for a time. They're both slight in stature. They're both aggressive in personality. They both are supposedly very charming men and extremely ambitious.
At the core of the dispute was a political rivalry that had been brewing for 15 years. Hamilton believed that Burr was self-serving and dangerous, and Burr believed that Hamilton had persistently opposed all of his political ambitions. It all came to a head when Burr was shown a letter published in a Federalist newspaper describing Hamilton's poor opinion of Burr.
He looked upon Burr as a dangerous man and one who ought not to be trusted with the reins of government.
And he says in this letter, you should have heard what Hamilton was saying about Burr, and repeats some of the things, and then says, I could tell you even more despicable things that he said, but I won't put them in this letter, because letters do tend to be captured and published, as this one is.
Burr demanded an explanation, and following a lengthy correspondence, Burr demanded a duel. Hamilton accepted, but was extremely ambivalent. He was a lawyer agreeing to break the law, and a church-going man planning to kill. And maybe above all else, Hamilton was a man who had given his own son, Philip, advice on dueling, advice that led to Philip's death.
He went to his father looking for advice on how do you duel. And Hamilton told him, apparently at the time, that a good Christian doesn't shoot at another Christian. So a good man would withhold his fire on the field. And Philip is fatally wounded. Philip dies, I think, the next day in great agony. And certainly his decision to not fire has to be influenced by the fact that he had told his son 3 years earlier, a good Christian doesn't fire at another man.
So why, with such misgivings, would Hamilton consider dueling Burr?
For politicians, it's very important to fight duels in order to maintain one's following. Because if you don't have a following, you're going to have nobody to do your errands for you, to put up the handbills, to support your nomination, to give speeches in your behalf, and so on. And so very often duels are a result of that, that there must be, on the part of the leader, a willingness to lay down his life, in a sense, for his friends.
For an example, actually, Hamilton at one point gets involved in a brawl on the street with a Republican. Actually tries to break up a fight between a Republican and a Federalist. And the Republican turns around and essentially says, I don't have to listen to you. You refused to duel once.
On July 11, 1804, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr met across from New York City in New Jersey on a cliff overlooking the Hudson at Weehawken. Their seconds gave them their weapons. They took their positions. Hamilton's second, Pendleton, announced the duel.
Ready, Mr. Hamilton? Present. Ready, Mr. Burr? Present. Fire.
Burr's pistol fired, fatally wounding Hamilton. Hamilton's gun also fired. However, it's still unknown whether he fired intentionally to hit Burr or whether his pistol discharged accidentally as Hamilton fell forward.
It's hard to imagine that after all of this sort of agonizing soul searching on Hamilton's part, and after his son didn't shoot, it's hard to imagine that he would sort of go out there and lower his gun and deliberately shoot at Burr, but I suppose it's hard to know what someone's going to do when they're out there facing someone else's pistol.
They say that Hamilton shot up in the air, but then Pendleton said he didn't do that until he was hit by Burr's ball coming out of the pistol, and actually he cut a twig just above Burr's head. I don't know, was he bringing the pistol down or to fire, or was he bringing it up and too far, or what, that nobody will ever know.
People throughout the United States mourn the loss of one of America's most popular statesmen. Aaron Burr was suspended from the New York bar and charged with murder in New Jersey. A pariah, he exiled himself to Florida. Years later, he returned to New York, but his political and social fortunes never revived. He died less wealthy and less popular in 1836.
Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!
On January 24, 1848, gold was discovered on the South Fork of the American River, near what later became known as Sacramento, California. Within less than a year, hundreds of thousands of 49ers headed west, and settlers began to populate the vast lands between the Mississippi and the Pacific. With them, they brought diverse religious, cultural, and political beliefs, and a sense of self-reliance. They were principally young men, far from home, who were prone to violence.
During the California Gold Rush in the 1850s, you had all manner of violence going on at the same time. You had all types of outlaw gangs that were committing horrible murders. You had peace officers trying to capture and kill these outlaws. You had vigilance committees trying to suppress lawlessness, sometimes by shooting criminals, most times by hanging them. You had all types of private violence going on. Personal brawls and quarrels and fandango halls and brothels. And at the same time, you had an extraordinary amount of formal dueling going on.
From 1850 to 1860, more duels took place in California than in the rest of the United States put together. Though many followed the formal rules of dueling, this was a frontier. And California became famous for its bizarre duels. One of the best-known encounters was between the celebrated Gold Rush actress Lola Montez and a California newspaper editor who had given her a bad review.
And she decided to settle the matter with a duel of her own invention. She challenged the editor to a duel whereby two pills would be placed in a box, one of them a harmless pill, the other poisonous. Both pills would be identical. The box would be shaken up. They would each take a pill, and whoever lived would live, and whoever got the poisonous pill would die. And needless to say, the editor declined the offer.
Another duel involved two miners and the enormous water hoses they used for hydraulic mining to wash away hillsides and expose gold veins. The hoses were called giants.
And what they did was they fought a duel with two giants and doused each other with water. And fortunately, neither man was badly hurt. But when you can see that these giants are much more powerful than a fire hose, that if this force of this water can wash away a hillside, it can certainly do some damage to a man.
But surprisingly, one of the best-known types of Western duels, the quick-draw gunfight, was a myth that never really happened.
The Western gunfight, as seen on television, is completely preposterous. The Western gunfight, where the two gunslingers face each other down on Main Street with holsters tied down and guns down around their knees. And they have a fast-draw gunfight in the street. Those types of gunfights did not occur in the Old West. It was the man who could draw his weapon and aim it carefully and put a bullet where it was supposed to go. That was the man who'd win a gunfight.
There are those who say that that was a setup to murder Broderick. I mean, there are people that say that the chivalry faction of the Democratic Party actually contrived the affront so that there would be a duel so that they could murder Broderick.
One of the last deadly duels of the West was one of the last important duels in America. It was between United States Senator David C. Broderick and former California Supreme Court Justice David Terry. The immediate cause was an accusation by Terry that Broderick was a traitor. The more likely cause was a political rivalry. Terry was pro-slavery and Broderick was an abolitionist. As the Civil War approached and the issue of slavery became divisive, this duel was an expression of California's and America's bitter disagreement.
Your choice of weapons, sir.
I choose these weapons.
They met on September 13, 1859, in a secluded area outside of San Francisco. On the field, Terry won a coin toss and the right to select the dueling pistols. He chose those brought by his own second.
They both had hair triggers, but the pistol that Broderick chose had a very severe hair trigger, which could actually, the gun could actually be fired by a simple jerking of the pistol.
The suggestion was that one of them was marked so that Terry would know. Now this is just speculation afterwards, or people, you know, there was a great mythology that grew up after this, but the argument was that if one had been marked, Terry would know whether he had the one with the hair trigger or not.
The duelists took their positions. One of Broderick's seconds, named Colton, announced the duel.
Are you ready, gentlemen?
Ready. Ready.
Broderick, he had to be kind of psychologically down in the dumps. They had just come through the election cycle, and his party had not done well. He had not done well, so he was down, and it looked as though his political career was certainly at a low ebb at that time. So people that were there said he was very rigid and strained, unlike himself, whereas Terry was very cool and collected, and maybe that contributed to the outcome.
Fire!
Almost immediately, Broderick's pistol discharged, but it fired early, before his arm had reached the correct position. The bullet hit the ground uselessly a few yards from his feet. Terry's shot, however, hit its mark. Broderick, fatally wounded, died 3 days later.
They have killed me because I was opposed to slavery and a corrupt administration.
The Civil War began in April of 1861. 11 southern states seceded from the Union over issues of trade and tariffs, states' rights, and slavery. Though the Civil War may have been unavoidable, some experts think part of the problem was miscommunication between the North and South. Miscommunication grounded in the South's strong adherence to the Code of Honor.
Maybe they were fighting a sort of giant duel in which The North basically was insulting the South, at least from the perspective of Southerners, and the South was issuing the challenge, and then the two met on the battlefield and settled this in some sort of a giant duel.
We tend to think of the Civil War as a result of simply the existence of slavery and an opposition to its continuation. It was much more complicated than that. When the North began to attack the South, assail it for the sin of slaveholding, and making claims that to expand slavery was morally reprehensible, that was an insult. That was as much an insult as calling a man a liar or a poltroon or a scoundrel.
And Northerners, again, not really understanding the language that Southerners are employing because they have a different sense of honor, a different notion of honor, couldn't really understand what was going on. So you got two people that are speaking to each other, they're using the same words, talking about the same issues, but the meaning behind those words is different.
By 1865, the Civil War was over. Like an honorable duelist, the South had fought nobly and bravely. They had lost the duel, but had maintained their honor. But the defeat of the South also marked the end of the reign of dueling in the New World.
The Civil War was so bloody and so violent, with 20 and 30,000 men dying in a single day. This type of violence and bloodletting tended to put these duels into perspective. Why would two men go and fight a duel over one man putting his foot on another man's chair when the country had gone through this horrible trauma?
When slavery comes to an end in 1865, you say a tremendous, quick, precipitous drop-off in dueling in the South. There are very, very few instances of dueling persisting after that time. So there's a clear connection between the end of slavery, that is the end of the Civil War, and the end of dueling.
America, the land of the free, the home of the brave. Americans, a rebellious people who created a new world, but brought with them old world customs. Customs like dueling that seem bizarre today, but offer unique insight into some of the riddles of America. Its hunger for equality, fascination with nobility, pride in self-reliance, concern over public opinion, and above all, a better understanding of America's ever-evolving and distinct sense of honor.
Not too many people are going to disagree that dueling is bad, but this sense of honor is something that I think is sorely lacking in American society. And if you think that once upon a time in America, there was a time where personal honor, integrity, and courage were more highly valued than a man's life. And it's something that I think Americans need to think about today. But as much as dueling has vanished, so too have vanished these notions of personal honor and courage and integrity.
We must examine our own lives, and the system of honor does not allow that. It's a repressive system. It's a one in which you try to repress your feelings and project outward any problems and throw them onto someone else or throw them onto some other issue. I think that's probably the lesson that one learns from this, that the actions that we take should be guided by an inner sense of worth rather than one in which we depend so much upon the opinion of others.
More than 3 centuries of deadly duels, from Plymouth Rock pilgrims and revolutionary officers to some of our greatest political heroes. A reflection of striking regional differences in the South, North, Wild West, even on the battlefields of the Civil War. A time machine to our past and possible insight into our present. The incredible history of dueling in the New World.